The wrench slipped, and Danny Harlow split his knuckle open on a corroded bolt, which was about the most exciting thing that had happened to him in 3 weeks. He sucked the blood off his finger and kept working. The Brannock Mule was a Category D salvage job, the kind of contract nobody fought over because the pay was barely worth the fuel to dock with the wreck. A dead cargo hauler that had drifted into Gannett Station's gravity net after its crew punched out in escape pods. Reactor coil failure, coolant leak, standard junk. Danny had taken the job because his rent was due and his options were thin. He had been aboard for 6 hours. The ship smelled like burnt plastic and old grease. Half the lights were dead. The reactor was salvageable, but ugly, a patch job that would take another day at least. Danny worked alone, which was how he preferred it. People complicated things. Machines just needed patience. That he was tracing a pressure leak through the lower cargo bay when he noticed something wrong with the wall. The sealant along a rear bulkhead was newer than the rest of the ship. Somebody had welded a panel in place and then painted over it to match the surrounding metal. It was a good job, professional even, but Danny had been crawling through ship guts since he was 16 years old. He could feel when a wall was lying to him that he cut through the false panel with his torch. Behind, it was a compartment that was not on any of the ship's official schematics. The space was roughly the size of a small apartment, climate-controlled, humming with its own independent power cell. And it was full of crates. Danny counted the rows. 40 crates, 10 eggs per crate, each egg roughly the size of a watermelon. They were beautiful in a way that made his stomach drop. Iridescent scales covered every shell, shimmering between deep blue and emerald green under the faint light of the cryosystem. A thin layer of frost coated each one. The air in the compartment was cold enough to make his breath visible that he knew what they were. Everybody in the galaxy knew what Valkyr eggs looked like. The dragons were one of the oldest species in known space, predating most civilizations by tens of thousands of years. Their eggs were sacred. Their nesting worlds were protected by treaties that carried the kind of penalties nobody tested. Possessing a single Valkyr egg without authorization from the elders was punishable by death. Not imprisonment, not fines, death. Every species in the Galactic Council had agreed to that, including humanity. Danny was standing in front of roughly 400 of them that he stepped back and almost tripped over his own toolbox. His brain ran through options in the order a panicking man would. Call station security. Get off the ship. Pretend he never saw this. But the cryosystem's power cell was whining, a high thin sound that meant it was losing charge. The temperature readings on the nearest crate were already climbing. If the system died, every egg in this room would begin thawing at once, and a rapid thermal shift could kill the embryos inside. Danny could not just walk away from 400 living things about to die. He dragged his portable generator from the engine room and wired it into the cryosystem to buy time. It was a temporary fix, maybe 12 hours if he was lucky. He needed a call for help. He ran to the cockpit and tried the comms array. Dead. The antenna housing had been damaged when the crew abandoned ship, and the backup transmitter had been stripped for parts, probably by the same smugglers who had installed the hidden compartment. He went back to the cargo bay to think. As he stood there, staring at the rows of gently frosted eggs, he heard sound. A soft crack, no louder than a fingernail tapping glass. One of the eggs on the edge of the nearest crate had begun to thaw faster than the others, sitting closest to the gap where the false panel had been cut away. The frost on its surface had melted. A thin fracture line ran down the center of the shell. Danny watched as the crack widened. A piece of shell fell away. Something moved inside. A small head emerged, pale silver with enormous dark eyes that blinked against the dim light. The creature was no bigger than a house cat, with translucent wings pressed wet against its body and tiny claws that scrabbled against the remains of its shell. It tumbled out of the crate and hit the deck with a soft thump that IT looked up at Danny. He looked down at it. The hatchling made a sound that was somewhere between a chirp and a whimper, then crawled directly toward him and pressed itself against his boot. Its body was shaking. Danny knew enough about Velker biology to understand what was happening. Imprinting. The first living creature a hatchling saw became its bond. That bond was permanent, that he was now psychically tethered to a baby dragon while standing in a ship full of stolen eggs with a dying cryo system and no way to call for help. Danny picked up the hatchling. It was warm against his hands, warmer than something that had just come out of a frozen egg had any right to be. It stopped shaking and pressed its head under his chin. He could feel its heartbeat, rapid and strong. He found the smuggler's manifest in a locked drawer in the cockpit, cracked it open with a pry bar. Reth Syndicate, black market auction, outer rim delivery. The crew had abandoned ship planning to send a retrieval team once they arranged a tow. Danny looked down at the hatchling tucked inside a jacket. He looked at the dead comms array. He looked at the manifest. The retrieval team could show up any hour. He started fixing the antenna. The antenna was held together with solder, electrical tape, and a level of optimism that Danny did not actually feel. He had spent 4 hours rebuilding the comms array from salvage components, working with one hand because the hatchling refused to be put down. Every time he set the little creature on a flat surface, it screamed. Not chirped, screamed. A high-pitched wail that vibrated through the metal walls and made Danny's teeth ache. So it rode in a pouch he had fashioned from a strip of thermal insulation, strapped across his chest like a sling, and it watched him work with those enormous dark eyes. The signal he managed to push out was weak. It would barely reach past the station's outer marker, which meant station security would hear it, but so would anyone else monitoring local frequencies. Danny did not call station security. He had thought about it and decided against it. Gannett Station was a mid-rim trade hub, which meant it was run by people who valued commerce over justice. If he reported 400 stolen Velker eggs, the station authority would impound the ship, seize the eggs as evidence, and Danny would spend the next 2 years in a holding cell while lawyers from 6 different species argued about jurisdiction. The eggs would sit in a warehouse. The hatchling bonded to him would be taken away and studied. None of that helped. Instead, he dug through the ship's communication logs until he found something useful. The Brannock Mule's previous crew had blocked several diplomatic frequencies to avoid detection, and one of them was a Velker patrol channel. Danny unblocked it and sent a short message. He identified himself, gave his coordinates, described what he had found, and asked for help. Then he sat down on the cockpit floor with his back against the wall and waited. The hatchling fell asleep against his chest. Its breathing was slow and even, and each exhale released a tiny puff of warmth that fogged the air in front of Danny's face. He studied it while it slept. The silver scales were so pale they were almost white, shot through with faint veins of blue that pulsed gently with each heartbeat. Its wings were folded tight, still damp, membranes so thin he could see the light through them. It weighed almost nothing. Danny had never wanted children. He had never wanted pets. He had wanted to fix ships, get paid, and be left alone. The universe apparently had other plans. 3 hours later, the ship's proximity sensors pinged. Danny scrambled to the cockpit and checked the readings. A vessel had dropped out of warp at the edge of the station's zone, running Valkyr identification codes. It was a patrol cruiser, sleek and angular, moving fast that IT docked without asking permission. The airlock cycled, and 3 figures boarded the Brannick Mule. The one in front was tall, sharp-featured, dressed in dark armor that seemed to shift between black and deep violet. Her eyes were gold and ancient. Danny knew he was looking at a Valkyr elder in humanoid diplomatic form. The 2 behind her were warriors, broader, heavier, with scale patterns visible on their exposed skin and hands that ended in claws they were not bothering to retract. The elder stopped 6 paces from Danny and looked at him the way someone might look at a stain on expensive carpet. She introduced herself as Surin. Her voice was cold. She told Danny that the Valkyr had been searching for this clutch for 6 months, ever since it was stolen from a nesting world called Dravine in a raid that killed 14 Guardians and nearly collapsed the Galactic Peace Accords. She told him that finding a lone human sitting among the eggs was not a comforting sight. Danny opened his mouth to explain. Before he could speak, the hatchling woke up and poked its head out of the pouch. It looked at Surin and chirped once, then buried its face back against Danny's chest. Surin went very still. One of the warriors stepped forward and reached for Danny. Surin stopped him with a word. She stared at the hatchling for a long moment, then at Danny. She asked him when it had hatched. Danny told her. She asked if it had seen anyone else first. Danny said no. Surin closed her eyes. When she opened them, something in her expression had changed. Not softer, not warmer, but different, the way a locked door looks different from a wall. She told Danny that a Valkyr imprint bond was sacred. It could not be broken, could not be transferred, could not be ignored. If Danny died, the hatchling's mind would shatter. Danny showed her the smuggler's manifest. He showed her the rigged cryo system and the failing power cell. He told her everything. Surin examined the eggs in silence, running her hands over the crates, and Danny could see faint light trailing from her fingertips as she checked each one, as she confirmed they were all alive. Then the station's proximity alarm screamed. 3 new contacts dropping out of warp, running hot, armed, heading straight for the Brannick Mule. Surin looked at the scanner readings, and her golden eyes went hard. The Reth Syndicate had come to collect their cargo. The first boarding team came through the port airlock with cutting torches and automatic weapons, expecting a dead ship and an easy retrieval. They found a Valkyr elder instead. Surin met them in the main corridor with her 2 warriors, and for about 30 seconds the fight was beautiful in a terrible way. The warriors moved like liquid fire, faster than anything that size should move, claws cutting through body armor as if it were wet paper. Surin did not bother shifting in her combat form. She simply raised one hand, and a wave of heat turned the corridor into an oven. The first squad fell back screaming, but there were 3 syndicate ships, and the boarding teams kept coming. Danny watched the initial fight from the corridor junction near the cargo bay and understood 2 things very quickly. First, the Valkyr were terrifying combatants, but there were only 3 of them, and the ship had multiple entry points. Second, the Syndicate was not going to stop. Those eggs were worth a fortune, enough to fund a small war, and the enforcers coming through the airlocks were the kind of people who had been promised a cut. He told Surin he could help. She looked at him like he had offered to help a bonfire burn. Danny did not argue. He just left that he knew this ship. He had spent hours crawling through its maintenance shafts, tracing wiring, mapping pressure lines. The Brannock Mule was a standard Galloway-class cargo hauler, which meant its guts were a maze of access tunnels, coolant pipes, and emergency conduits that connected every section of the vessel. The Syndicate enforcers were using the main corridors. Danny used everything else. The first group he dealt with had come through the starboard emergency hatch and were moving toward the cargo bay from the lower deck. Danny crawled ahead of them through a maintenance shaft, dropped into the corridor behind a pressure junction, and vented the coolant line. Liquid coolant at negative 80 degrees sprayed across the corridor in a white cloud. The enforcers stumbled, blinded, their weapons frosting over. Danny sealed the blast door behind them and locked it with an override code he had pulled from the ship's engineering console. 5 down, locked in a freezer. The second group was smarter. They came through the ventral airlock and spread out in pairs, covering angles, moving slow. Danny rerouted the ship's emergency power to the deck plates in Section 4 and turned them into a conductor. When the enforcers stepped onto the charge plating, the shock knocked them flat. It was not enough to kill, but it was enough to make their muscles stop working for several minutes. Danny zip-tied their hands with cable straps while they twitched on the floor. The hatchling helped. Danny had not expected that. The little creature had its head poking out of the chest pouch, and every time Danny approached a blind corner, the hatchling would chirp or go silent in a pattern Danny quickly learned to read. Chirp and clear. Silence meant danger. It could feel heat signatures through the walls, sensing the body warmth of anyone nearby. Danny did not question it. He just listened. The third group was the problem. They were led by a figure that Danny heard before he saw. Heavy footsteps, deliberate, shaking the deck plates with each stride. Gorvin. The name was on the smuggler's manifest as the Syndicate's lead enforcer for this operation. He was enormous, nearly 7 feet of scaled muscle from a species Danny did not recognize, with 4 arms and a face that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated the concept of mercy. Gorvin found Danny in the engine room. Danny had been trying to circle back to reinforce Surin's position when the enforcer cut off his route. The engine room was a dead end. Gorvin filled the doorway, looked at Danny and the tiny dragon poking out of his chest pouch, and laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. He said something about humans being fragile and stepped forward. Danny grabbed the reactor coil he had originally come aboard to replace. It was a heavy cylinder of compressed energy cells, cracked and unstable, which was why the ship had been dead in the first place. He had been planning to swap it out. Instead, he jammed his welding torch into the cracked housing and threw it. The concussion blew out every light in the engine room. It threw Gorvin backward through the bulkhead wall and into the corridor beyond. It also threw Danny into an instrument panel hard enough to crack 2 ribs and open a gash above his eye. The hatchling screamed. Danny's ears were ringing. His hands were burned and his vision was swimming. He got up anyway. Gorvin was unconscious in the corridor, half buried in twisted metal. Danny stepped over him and limped toward the cargo bay. The hatchling pressed against his chest, trembling, its small heart hammering so fast it felt like a vibration. When he reached Surin, she was finishing the last of the enforcers in the main corridor. Her warriors were wounded but standing. She looked at Danny, bleeding, burned, carrying a baby dragon and a welding torch, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she dipped her head, just slightly, The way Danny had seen Vailker acknowledge a fellow warrior in old documentary footage, Danny leaned against the wall and tried not to pass out. The cryo system died with a sound like a long exhale, a slow whine that dropped in pitch until it became silence. Danny heard it from where he sat slumped against the cargo bay wall with his burned hands resting on his knees. He lifted his head. The temperature in the hidden compartment was already climbing. Frost on the nearest crates had begun to melt, sending thin trails of water down the sides to pool on the deck. Surin felt it before the instruments confirmed it. She crossed the cargo bay in 3 strides and placed her palm against the nearest egg. The light that usually trailed from her fingertips when she touched the shells flickered and went uneven. She pulled her hand back and turned to Danny with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Fear, she explained quickly. The eggs were entering thermal transition. Under normal circumstances, Vailker eggs hatched on nesting worlds in carefully controlled environments. The elders performed warmth songs, ancient vocal resonances that synchronized the embryos and guided them through the hatching process. Without warmth songs, a mass thawing like this would cause neurological fracturing. The hatchlings would emerge disoriented and bonded, unable to form the psychic connections that defined Vailker identity. They would go feral. Hundreds of feral Vailker hatchlings was not just a tragedy. It was a disaster that would take generations to recover from. Surin tried. She stood in the center of the cargo bay and began a warmth song. Her voice dropped in a registers Danny could not hear, frequencies that made his bones vibrate. The eggs nearest to her responded, pulsing faintly with amber light. But the range was limited. She was one elder. A proper hatching ceremony required dozens. Her song reached perhaps 30 eggs. The other 370 sat in the dark, their shells beginning to crack at the edges. Danny watched the cracks spread. He looked down at the hatchling in his chest pouch. It was awake, staring at the eggs with its dark eyes, and it was making a sound. A low hum, barely audible, vibrating at a frequency that Danny could feel in his sternum. He placed his hand over the hatchling and felt the hum travel up through his palm and into his arm. He did not think about what he did next. Thinking would have stopped him because thinking would have told him it was impossible. He simply slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor among the crates, placed his burned hands on the 2 nearest eggs, and started talking that he talked about Earth. He had not been home in 9 years, but the memories were still there, stored in a part of his brain that ship schematics and repair manuals had never overwritten. He talked about the ocean, how it looked at dawn when the light hit the water and turned everything gold. He talked about mountains, about the way clouds caught on peaks and tore apart like cotton. He talked about rain on a tin roof. He talked about thunderstorms rolling across flat plains, the sky going green before the wind hit. He talked about campfires, the pop and crack of dry wood, the smell of smoke in cold air. His voice was low and steady. He was not singing. He did not know any songs. He was just talking the way a person talks to something small and frightened, the way his mother had talked to him when he was sick as a child, the way humans have been talking to helpless things since before they had language for it. The hatchling's hum changed. It deepened, found a resonance with Danny's voice, and amplified it. The vibration spread outward from Danny's chest through his hands and into the eggs he was touching. And those eggs began to glow. Soft, warm light, pulsing in rhythm with his words. Surin stopped her own song. She turned and stared. The glow spread. Egg to egg, crate to crate, like a wave moving outward from Danny's position. The cracking stopped. The shells stabilized. The light pulsed gently, synchronized, all 400 eggs breathing together in time with the rhythm of Danny's voice and the hatchling's hum. Danny kept talking. He talked about his father's workshop, about the smell of engine oil and the sound of a wrench on a bolt. He talked about snow. He talked about the feel of grass under bare feet. He did not know if the embryos could understand him. He did not care. He talked because something in him understood that these small lives in their fragile shells needed to hear a voice that was not afraid. And Danny Harlow, despite being terrified, had spent his whole life being steady when things were breaking. The eggs held. They did not hatch, but they did not fracture. They sat in their crates, glowing warm and even, for 100 tiny hearts beating in unison with the voice of a human mechanic who had come aboard to fix a coolant leak. Surin stood motionless for a very long time. Her warriors watched from the doorway, silent. When Danny finally ran out of words, he just breathed. The hatchling hummed. The eggs glowed. The cargo bay, which had been a cold metal box full of stolen lives, now felt like something else. Something warm. Something safe. Surin walked over and crouched in front of Danny. She looked at him with those ancient gold eyes and told him quietly that she had lived for 400 years. She had attended hundreds of hatching ceremonies. She had heard warm songs performed by the greatest elders of her people. She had never seen a warm song performed by someone who did not even know what it was. Danny looked at her through the blood drying on his face and said that he was not singing. He was just talking. Surin said that was what made it extraordinary. The Valkyr battle fleet arrived like a judgment. 40 warships dropped out of warp in a formation so precise it looked choreographed. Each vessel sliding into position around Gannett Station with the quiet confidence of a species that had been fighting wars since before most civilizations had discovered fire. The remaining Wrath Syndicate ships, 2 of the original 3 that had not already been crippled, took one look at the fleet and ran. They did not make it far. A pair of Valkyr interceptors ran them down in less than a minute and forced them to surrender without firing a shot. The dragons did not need to fire. Their reputation was the weapon. Danny did not see any of this. He was unconscious on the cargo bay floor, still surrounded by 400 gently glowing eggs, with a silver hatchling curled on his chest and his burned hands resting on the crates where he had left them. His body had finally made the decision his mind had been refusing to make for the last several hours and shut down. Surin met the fleet's command shuttle at the airlock. The figure that stepped aboard the Brannock mule was not what Danny would have expected if he had been awake to see her. The high matriarch of the Valkyr looked like a woman in her 50s, silver-haired, calm-faced, dressed in simple dark clothing without ornament or insignia. She carried no weapons. She did not need them. Every Valkyr in the corridor, including Surin, dropped to one knee when she passed. Surin gave her report in full. The stolen clutch from Dravine. The smuggler's manifest. The failing cryosystem. The human mechanic who had found the eggs by accident, bonded with the first hatchling by chance, fought off the retrieval team with maintenance tools, and then stabilized 400 eggs with his voice alone. The matriarch listened without interrupting. When Surin finished, the matriarch walked into the cargo bay alone. She stood over Danny for a long time. The eggs around him were still glowing, still pulsing in that slow, synchronized rhythm he had established. The hatchling on his chest lifted its head, looked at the matriarch, and chirped once before settling back down. The matriarch knelt and placed her hand on the nearest egg. The light under her palm brightened, and Danny could have sworn the egg leaned in her touch. Though that was impossible, she checked every row. She moved through the crates with a patience that spoke of centuries of practice, touching each egg, reading the life inside it with whatever sense the Veilker used for such things. When she finished, she returned to where Surin waited at the entrance. Every egg was viable. Every embryo was healthy. Not a single one had been lost. The matriarch said 3 words. Clutch saving performed. Surin closed her eyes. One of the warriors made a sound in his throat that might have been disbelief. The term had weight. Danny would learn later what it meant, but the short version was this. In the entire recorded history of the Veilker, spanning 60,000 years and countless wars and disasters, a clutch saving had been performed fewer than 200 times. It was the act of stabilizing an endangered clutch through personal resonance alone, without tools, without ceremony, without preparation. It had never been performed by a non-Veilker. Not once. Not in 60,000 years. The Galactic Council was notified within the hour. The stolen Dravine clutch had been recovered. The Reth Syndicate was declared a galactic-level threat, their assets frozen, their leadership marked for arrest across every jurisdiction in known space. Gannett Station's administration, deeply embarrassed that a major smuggling operation had been running through their docks, fell over themselves to cooperate. They offered Danny a permanent berth, full pardons for any technical violations related to the salvage, and a lifetime maintenance contract. Danny woke up 2 days later in a Veilker medical bay aboard the fleet's command ship. The room was warm and quiet, lit by a soft amber glow that came from the walls themselves. His hands were healed. His ribs were mended. The gash above his eye was gone. Not even a scar. Veilker Biotech was apparently very good at fixing humans. The hatchling was sitting on his pillow, watching him with those dark eyes. When Danny opened his own eyes, it chirped and pressed its nose against his cheek. Surin was standing by the door. She told him what had happened. The fleet. The arrests. The matriarch's declaration. She told him that under Veilker law, he was now Clutch Guardian, a title that made him the sworn protector of the Dravine Clutch until the last egg hatched and the last hatchling was settled. Danny stared at her. He asked how many eggs were in the clutch. Point 401, Surin said, counting the one already hatched. Danny looked at the hatchling on his pillow. It looked back at him and chirped again, a happy sound, completely unconcerned with the fact that it had just made a ship mechanic responsible for 400 of its siblings. Danny lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. He had come aboard the Brannick Mule to fix a coolant leak. The job was supposed to take a day, maybe 2. He was supposed to get paid, cover his rent, and move on to the next wreck. Instead, he was the guardian of 400 dragons that he asked Surin if the job came with a dental plan. Surin tilted her head and said she did not understand the question. The hatchling made a sound that, despite every logical argument against it, sounded exactly like a laugh. Danny closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he smiled. 6 months passed, and Danny Harlow's life became something he could not have predicted with 1,000 years of warning. The Veilker moved the Dravine clutch to a nesting world called Orin, a planet of warm stone valleys and thermal rivers where the air itself seemed to hum with the same resonance Danny had stumbled into on the Brannick Mule. They built a hatching chamber carved into the side of a mountain, large enough to hold all 400 eggs in a single circular room open to the sky. Danny was given quarters adjacent to the chamber because the eggs, according to the Valkyr physicians, responded to his proximity. When he was near, they glowed brighter. When he was absent for more than a few hours, the glow dimmed. No one could explain it. The Valkyr had theories involving psychic resonance and cross-species harmonic bonding, but Danny suspected the truth was simpler than that. He had talked to them when they were afraid, and they remembered. The silver hatchling, whom Danny had started calling Pip in his head before catching himself and settling on the name Sela instead, grew quickly. Within a month, it was the size of a large dog. Within 3, it was the size of a horse, still silver, still translucent winged, still absolutely convinced that Danny's shoulder was an acceptable perch despite weighing over 100 kilograms. Danny had bruises on his collarbones that never fully healed because Sela refused to accept that physics applied to their relationship. The hatching began in the 4th month. It happened slowly, 1 or 2 eggs per day at first, then more. The Valkyr elders performed the warmth songs, full ceremonies now, with dozens of voices creating harmonics that shook the stone walls. Danny stood in the chamber during every hatching. He did not sing. He talked the same way he had on the ship, low and steady, about earth and oceans and thunderstorms. The elders incorporated his voice into the ceremony as if it belonged there. Surin told him later that the hatchlings who emerged during his speaking were calmer than the others, more focused, quicker to bond. She said this without surprise, as if it had been obvious from the beginning that by the 6th month, 312 hatchlings had emerged. Each one was different. Colors ranged from deep black to brilliant gold, some with patterned scales, some with smooth hides, some with wings that spread wide on the first day, and others who took weeks to unfold them. Danny learned to tell them apart. He learned their sounds, their habits, which ones were bold and which were shy. He learned that Valkyr hatchlings played like puppies and fought like cats, and slept in piles that generated enough heat to warm an entire room. He also learned that being Clutch Guardian was not a ceremonial title. The Valkyr took it seriously. Delegations visited from across the galaxy to see the recovered Dravine Clutch, and Danny was expected to be present to speak on behalf of the hatchlings, to stand in rooms full of alien diplomats and explain what had happened on the Brannick Mule. He was terrible at it. He was a mechanic. Public speaking made him sweat through his shirt. But Sela stood behind him during every meeting, now large enough to look most diplomats in the eye, and something about having a full-grown Valkyr at his back made people listen when he talked. The Galactic Council used the Dravine Clutch recovery to crack down on the Reth Syndicate. 18 senior members were arrested. Their black market networks were dismantled across 4 sectors. The Valkyr, who had been quietly furious for 6 months, made it clear that any future interference with their nesting worlds would be met with the kind of response that made species go extinct. Nobody doubted them. Danny received messages from humans across the galaxy. Some were congratulatory. Some were confused. A few were angry, accusing him of getting involved in alien politics. He ignored most of them. He responded to one from a mechanic on a station near Earth who asked if it was true that a human had sung dragon eggs to sleep. Danny wrote back that he had not been singing. He had just been talking. There was a difference, even if the Valkyr could not see it. The matriarch visited Orin once, near the end of the 6th month, when the last eggs were preparing to hatch. She found Danny in the hatching chamber at dawn, sitting on the stone floor surrounded by hatchlings of various sizes, all sleeping. while Sela lay curled around him like a silver wall. The matriarch sat down across from him and said nothing for a long time. Then she told him that the Veilker had a concept called the unlooked-for guardian. It appeared in their oldest stories, older than space travel, older than writing. A protector who arrived without intention, who acted without understanding, who saved what needed saving simply because that was what they were. She said the stories never described what species the guardian was. She said she now understood why. Danny looked at her. He said he was just a guy who fixed ships. The matriarch smiled. She said that was the point. The last egg hatched that evening. Danny was there. He held the hatchling, small and green and loud, and handed it to the elder waiting beside him. The chamber was full. 401 Veilker, from the oldest elder to the newest hatchling, and one human mechanic who had come to fix a coolant leak and stay to guard a clutch. Sela pressed her enormous head against Danny's back. He leaned into her and closed his eyes. For a man who preferred to work alone, he had ended up with a very large family that he did not mind.